Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person to unburden the gods.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for another episode. Those who are listening live and those who are listening to the recording, welcome one and all. Let's see. Patient Zero, thank you for being here. Rondon, Revised Sociology, great to see you again. Oh, Zedika Redirect, great to see you here. Glad you could make it. Okay, so this week we have quite a lot to go over as usual. Since last week I was a little bit off with my estimation of how long it would take us to get through. Welcome, Crimson Glad. Glad you could join us. So, to remind us all, we're speaking about Abraham, and we're talking about the time in history nearing the end of Ur's reign, of Sumer in general, and the figure of Abraham, his character, plays a very crucial role in the story and in the unfolding events. So we're going to delve a bit deeper into his character today. And I'll just say before that this this might be a little bit more exciting for someone with more knowledge of Abraham's figure and knowing sort of the big changes and the revelations that Sitchin is unfolding here. But nonetheless, we'll continue. And I think it's a very interesting story, regardless of whether he's just a random figure that we've heard of, or if he's this personified sort of myth of the Jewish people in the beginning of the whole story. And here we see not anything in defiance of that, but definitely a different perspective on his character. Alien Honey, welcome as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words. Okay, so let's get into it. I believe we sort of left off in the middle, and so I'm going to recap a little bit and carry on with a little bit of who Abraham was and some of Sitchin's discoveries. So I spoke last week about the difference between the Jews being Jewish and Hebrew, the Hebrews in general. And we went over the fact that Hebrew, originally the term comes from Eber in Hebrew, which stems from the Sumerian term for Nibiru, which is the crossing planet, the crossing place. And the place that was called the crossing of Nibiru, the planet, and Earth was the mission control. And so this was the place that was in the city of Nippur, and Abraham was born in Nippur and then moved later on to the city of Ur. And so we know his figure as Abraham. That's usually the name that he's referred to, but that was actually a name that he was given much later in the texts. And it's of great importance. Everyone is taught in school that a lot of the names that are given in the Bible are then sort of changed to become religious or Jewish names, Hebrew names. And so Abraham's original name was Abram, without the H sound, and then the addition of the H, the Old Testament, or I should say the interpretations, the Jewish interpretations, have the H, since it's a sacred letter that signifies the Lord. Then the addition of the H to his name is sort of the entrance of the Lord into his life, which is fine. But for our research and for what Sitchin says, this change actually marks the beginning, as it were, of the Semitic languages. And so the switch from Abram to Avraham, was a change from the earlier Sumerian to the later Semitic, not Akkadian. I think Abraham, and that is actually generally a switch that was made for terms from Sumerian to any of the Semitic languages. But I think Akkadian was the first that it was translated into. And so the meaning of the word Abram is actually father's beloved. And so again, we get that same technique when we take the original Sumerian. Each of the syllables has its own meaning. And indeed, with the Semitic languages, some of that meaning carries on. In Hebrew, the word for father is av, at least the original biblical term. And Ram is actually means high, whether a high status or literally some place that's high, usually depicting something that's high up. But it's used metaphorically as well. And so beloved, as in raised up to be closer to the gods, was a common metaphor that was used. Interesting little side note, the word ram, is a word that appears in many different languages with somewhat similar meanings. So it's a Sanskrit word as well, Rama. It's a Hebrew word, and it's an English word, ram. So just a little tidbit for you guys. So the original meaning of Abraham's name was the father's beloved. And of course, father here means God. Specifically, Abraham's God, who was Enlil, as we know from where he was, the city of Nippur, under Enlil's custody, as it were. And Abraham had a wife, and I don't think we've actually even mentioned her last week. As some of you may know, Abraham's wife was Sarah in the English terminology. But again, this was a later name that was given to her, and the original name was actually Sarai. And the term for Sarai was a regal term meaning princess. And so this is an interesting clue into Abraham and his lineage and where he came from. What this means, and we're told in the text, is that Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. And so Sitchin actually makes the logical conclusion that if Sarai was his half-sister and she was also a princess, then they must share their royal father, who was indeed a high priest in Nippur before Abraham. And so we discover that Abraham, as we quickly mentioned before, was in fact of the priestly caste and was regal. He was not a commoner, as we sometimes sort of imagine him to being this sort of shepherd. He was actually among, kings. And Sitchin mentions, although there is no verification of this, but as he retraces Abraham's life, and specifically his early life, it seems that Abraham's father, Terach, moved with the family when Abraham was 10 years old from Nippur, where Abraham was born, this city of the mission control, to Ur, which was the capital of Sumer, the royal capital. And the reason for this transfer, it's claimed by Sitchin, was at that time, this was actually when Ur-Nammu first ascended the throne. And so if we remember, Ur-Nammu was the king who died disgracefully, and before then he was one of the chosen. He was a demigod, son of Nannar-Sin. And as he ascended the throne, there was a big change that occurred, which was the city of Nippur, which was always the religious center and the center for communicating with God, with Enlil, came under the control of Sumer general and of Ur-Nammu, the new king. And so it's suggested by Sitchin that because of this change, Terach and his family moved from Nibiru to Ur in order to sort of facilitate the transition and to, as one of the high priests of Nippur, to be a liaison, as it were. And so that's what happens to Abraham when he's 10 years old, and we don't hear much of his life in Nippur. Again, the Bible doesn't really mention any of this specifically because we sort of enter the story of Abraham after he is a grown man. But through the interpretation of the names, the lineage, the places that they visited, Sitchin retraces his early life. And so their family stays in Ur for the entirety of Ur-Nammu's reign. And when Ur-Nammu dies and Shulgi ascends the throne, there's a certain turmoil, as we said, and Shulgi does get it under control, but he leaves and he starts his campaign to sort of start putting down all of the rebellions that are happening. And so at this point, once again, Abraham and his family move. And they move to a place that's called Haran. For those who are there, I'm pretty sure we've gone over this last time, so I'm not going in too much detail. But again, if you have any questions or anything that I'm glossing over, please feel free to stop and ask. And I'll get to it when I get to it. So this whole discovery and research into ancient biblical figures is, as I've mentioned time and time again, a very difficult thing to do, and it's obviously loaded with competing theories, and it's pretty hard to pry the truth. And so it always helps, beyond having the physical geological evidence of certain clay tablets mentioning certain kings, having other corroborating evidence. And so the year, according to Sitchin, when he retraces back through the biblical terms, the year that Abraham was born was 2123 BC. So around 4,000 plus years ago. And so Abraham is in Ur until he is an older man, and then they move to Haran. Now, the reason that I mention this is because in discovering the age, the year that Abraham was living in, both for its importance to discover the different events of the time, but Sitchin comes across a very curious and interesting fact, I think. And so to understand this, for some of you, for those who may not know, there is a Jewish calendar, and the Jewish calendar is slightly different from the Gregorian in more ways than one, but one of them being the counting of the years. The Gregorian calendar obviously counts from the birth of Christ, hence BC, but the Jewish calendar starts counting from around 6,000 years ago, 5,800 and something. I can't remember exactly what the year is, but they start counting from around 6,000 years ago. And it's commonly conceived by most Jews and by the people that I've talked to that this is supposedly the beginning of creation, as it were. The Bible starts talking from Genesis, and it's counted backwards to there. And so this is the beginning of the creation of the world 6,000 years ago, which leads to all of our problems that we know the world physically was older. And so Sitchin comes across a very curious fact when we ask about the Hebrew origins and the Hebrew origins of Abraham. We see that there is a calendar that was started in Nippur, again, given by the gods, by the Anunnaki. And this calendar coincides with the Jewish calendar's starting date. And when you actually read the original in the Bible, it doesn't say this is counting from the beginning of time or from the beginning of creation. It actually literally says, since the counting of years began. And suddenly, when we think about the Nippurian calendar, the Sumerian origins, it takes on a very different meaning when the Jewish calendar, as all calendars do, started counting from a specific point in history and remembers that point obviously as an important event, but not as the beginning of creation, as has been misinterpreted through time. So I just thought that was a curious little tidbit. But if we continue with our story, Abraham moves with his family, with Terach, as it were, to Haran. Now, Haran is a very special place. We mentioned last week that it's the strategic crossing, and its area is both the crossing from north to south. This is along the sort of Jordan River, so from Canaan to Egypt, to Africa. And for those who are watching the video, you can see on the map that where Canaan is sort of west of Babylon, close to the Mediterranean Sea, that whole area beneath the Euphrates River. And Haran is about, I'm not going to say exactly because it's hard to say, but the center point, as it were. And so it's also the crossing from west to east, vice versa, from Mesopotamia to Canaan, and indeed to Africa, to Egypt. So it's a very important strategic place. Now, Abraham, with his family arriving from Mesopotamia, were obviously foreigners, and yet they seem to do very well and have good relations with the leaders from around, which again suggests that they had some sort of royal lineage. Now, it needs to be said that these moving from place to place are always done under the decree of God. This is not a decision that they make themselves, but this is following the orders of the deity. And this is true throughout Abraham's life. Obviously, being a priest, this is what he is trained to do. Now, at this point in the story, we again come across one of the characters who are coming back. And so the final showdown that we're approaching involves once again the god Marduk. Now, Marduk has tried time and time again to sort of establish himself as a leading figure and a leading god. He is, after all, the firstborn son of Enki. And we get the image, and I think also because of most of the sources that we've gone through were against Marduk, were the victors actually, we get this image of a not very successful attempt to seize control where it's not appropriate, and we might mistake Marduk for unimportant or someone that doesn't really need to be recognized as such. But this isn't really the case, and one of the easiest ways to see that, I think, is with Babylon. Probably the most famous empire from that time, if not least because of the cultural essence that name has taken on, being signifying this whole Western culture that we see, in the all sorts of cultural artifacts that we know. And so Babylon was this tremendously important and successful empire for many, many years. This was the doings of Marduk, and indeed he was the supreme deity there and always referred to as the god of gods, as the king of gods, as all the gods are referred to by their followers. But I don't want us to fall into this misconception that Marduk is somehow weak since he's been defeated all these times, or is somehow not a force to be reckoned with. And one of the first things that Marduk does indeed is start to make his presence known in Egypt, in the southern part of Egypt. As in that time in Egypt, there were two competing kingdoms, and the north and the south. Egypt for a very, very long time was divided, and Marduk is gaining more control in the south. Now, as this is happening, Marduk has a son, whom I think I mentioned in the last episode, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't think I said who he was. So his son was named Nabu, and we don't really hear much about him before. But at this point, whether he's simply, come of age and gained some sort of status and experience, he starts playing a much bigger role in the events that are coming. And so Marduk's son Nabu, since Marduk is in exile and cannot return to Mesopotamia, Marduk sends his son Nabu to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, and indeed to the countries around. Now, at this point, we'll remember that the Shulgi, the king who was after Ur-Nammu, has died. And so we're two kings past, as it were. And so again, the empire is in a state of turmoil. There are uprisings happening all across, and this sort of state of war comes back. And so once Shulgi dies, Marduk starts to make his move, and he gains following in Africa, in Egypt, and he sends his son Nabu to start causing rebellions in Mesopotamia as well, in Sumer and the surrounding kingdoms. Now, on top of this, he also establishes sort of alliances with certain kings who are in Mesopotamia, the lesser kings who were under Ur's rule until then, and in the Hindu Valley with Inanna's followers. And so this is the situation at which point Abraham was in Haran. Now, the Bible or no sources actually state what Abraham was doing in Haran, but seeing what follows, Sitchin sort of again figures out that part of Abraham's mission there was in fact learning military strategy. And since he had no experience prior to that we know of, it's actually rather conceivable, because we do see that at the time Haran, where Abraham was on the border of Canaan with the Hittim. I can't remember the pronunciation. Hittites? I can't remember exactly, but the Hittim in the biblical term. And the Hittites were known military and very proficient in strategic fighting, and indeed defended themselves against multiple attempted invasions. And it seems that Abraham could very likely have learnt from them, establishing relationship with them, and indeed actually recruiting some soldiers and learning different strategies from them. And so indeed, thank you very much. Who was a patient zero, right? I can't see because of the chat's up. Yes, it's always patient zero. Thank you so much. Yes, the Hittiti. I think we pronounce it. Anyway. And so following this, Abraham, who was a priest who had moved around but had really, until Haran, maintained the priestly both lifestyle and duties, now moves south towards Egypt. And in Egypt, he sides with the ruling pharaoh, who is in fact opposing Marduk and his army of followers. And Abraham joins the war and eventually manages to suppress the invasion by Marduk's followers and the army that he's opposing. And so, just one moment, if there is any problem with the sound, because I think I can hear a bit of a delay, but as long as you can hear okay, then we're all right. Let me know in the comments if there's any problem. So, Abraham moves from Haran to Egypt, faces the armies of Marduk in the war, defeats them, and then he returns. And when he returns from Egypt, he actually returns with a reinforced army. So again, it seems... Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. It seems that Abraham is sort of building an army, and he's both gaining people and soldiers, and also actual valuable currency, as it were. And so, thank you, Rhonda. So Abraham leaves Egypt with a much larger force than he came with, and he is now more proficient, more experienced in fighting these wars. So at the same time, yes, well, Marduk, Bleepcoin, first of all, thank you so much. I don't see that you joined. Wonderful to have you here. Just a quick reminder, and for those listening for the first time, Marduk has been an outcast, more or less. He was sent to Mars to be in charge of the Igigi when everything was happening on Earth. He is denied in his mind, rightful heirness as to Enki, and that's instead passed on to his younger brother. So he has again and again suffered a loss, and eventually even gave up his princely rights in order to be with a human woman. So we can see a very touchy god. Now, a side note, just since you mentioned that, Marduk was privy to an oracle who told him that he would wait for 24 years in the desert, and following those 24 years, he would rise to power. And so he has been sort of biding his time and waiting, and now he sees the signs. It's nearing the end of the 24 years that he was given, and he is under the absolute belief that he is the chosen one who was sent to redeem the Anunnaki and humanity and to make the world a better place. So let's not mistake for a moment that Marduk is not, in his mind, portraying the bad guy. He feels that this is finally, after thousands and thousands of years, his rightful time to shine. A very dangerous enemy to be fighting against. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that the volume, that the sound and everything is okay. Thank you so much for those kind words. So, Abraham returns from Egypt, and he settles in a rather unusual place, and that is the Negev. Now, for those who are unaware, as I'm sure most of you are, the Negev is a place in Israel today, and it's very simply put a desert. It's the most arid place in Israel. It's one of the driest, I think, in general. It's the northern border, as it were, but the northern part of it is the Dead Sea, and then it's just dry, arid, barren land for a third of the size of the country. And this is where Abraham, with all of his army and his people that he's gathered and his riches, decides to stop and camp and seems to wait. And once again, we don't really have a very good explanation, neither in archaeology and in history, nor in the Bible, for why this happens. Now, this is the next episode, as it were, and it's a pretty big one. So we're going to start with it in this episode, and I hope we'll see how far we get. We may have to continue a little bit more next week because there's a lot of sort of nuances that are difficult to grasp at first. But the story we're going to be talking about is a relatively, it's not very famous, although most religious Jews who studied the Bible will know it. But it's not one of the more famous ones, and for good reason. This is known as the War of the Nine Kings. I think in Wikipedia they refer to it as the War of Shittim or Shiddim. It's the War of 4 kings against 5 kings. That's how I always knew it, and that's how it's referred to in the Bible. Now, this is probably one of the most curious stories in the Old Testament, at least that I know, in terms of the lack of explanation. And in preparing for this episode, I actually wanted to read up a little bit about what the rabbinical modern Jewish interpreters say about this war. So first, let me give you the very quick outline that we get in the Bible itself. And I haven't actually got the quote because it's a lot of sort of names, and it names all the kings and the years and blah, blah, blah. It's not important for us. It's a rather simple story. And what happens is that 5 kings from the east, meaning from Mesopotamia, invade the west, invade Canaan, and appear to visit a few places along the way that are mentioned, and they eventually come across 4 kings, and they fight them in a battle, and the 5 kings are victorious. They push them back, and then at this point, the kings actually go and take the spoils from the defeated army. And among the spoils are slaves, and among the slaves is Abraham's nephew, and Lot, for those who might recognize the name. And so with this, Abraham, who surprisingly just happens to be very near there, gets word that Lot has been taken in this war, and he chases down the 5 kings and goes to war with them and defeats them and recaptures or rescues Lot and takes him back. Whereupon the 4 kings return upon hearing this that's happened, and they decide to try and beat the kings now that they've been defeated. And so they actually succeed, and they throw off the invaders, and they have the spoils. They come back with the spoils to Abraham, and they present them to him, saying, anything you want is yours, as he was the one who was in charge. And Abraham says that his reward is just working for the Lord, and the Lord will provide everything he needs. And that's it. That's basically the entirety of the story. And once again, obviously growing up religious and learning this in the Bible, you just don't think about it. You say that's an odd story to have, and that's it. You move on to the next one where some more interesting things happen. Even when I looked at the interpretation, they claim, obviously they say that this is a difficult one to interpret, but they say that what the story is trying to represent is once again Abraham's greatness and the greatness of the Lord and the greatness of Abraham's belief in him. And this story is all there just to show that Abraham can defeat the armies because the Lord is with him, and he is not taking any credit for it and remembers to recognize the Lord. That's it. Now that when I think about it, when I actually take a moment to sort of consider, that's a very weak explanation for a lot of very bizarre details. Who were these 5 kings? Who were the 4 kings? Why were they invading? If these 2 camps seem to be fighting, and they clearly were, the first war didn't involve Abraham at all, then what does it have to do with Abraham? And why was he so close when this all happened? Once again, I believe that Sitchin has unveiled the very curious answer. And once again, he's done it by comparing the shortened biblical version with the much longer Sumerian version. And I believe it's actually Babylonian, which was telling about this tale, but I can't remember the specific names. But we'll give the story in general because that's what we're interested. Once again, disclaimer: if you want any of the details, any of the compelling hard facts and proof, go and read the originals. He does a much better job than I will. So we have this very strange, bizarre occurrence that in the Bible seems to be completely disconnected with everything else. We're talking about Abraham, he's going north, he's going south, he's in Haran, and then suddenly these 5 kings from the east invade, and they fight these 4 kings, and they win, and what's going on? So if we look back at what Sitchin has just told us and where we are in the story, the 5 kings who invaded were actually the 5 kings from Mesopotamia, the leader of which, whose name was Kedorlaomer in the Bible and Kudulagar in the Babylonian tale. He was the king at the time who was charged with this invasion. And the story goes that there were kings from Canaan who were rebellious. And the way that they were rebelling against Sumer was that they were going after other gods. They were basically veering off the gods who were worshipped in Mesopotamia. And so this already gives us a little clue as to what's happening here. According to Sitchin, Marduk's son, Nabu, was increasing his influence, and that included Canaan as well, where these 4 kings are found. And so word gets to Mesopotamia, to Sumer, that Marduk's influence is growing, and that indeed some of the kings who were under Sumer's rule, as it were, empire, are now rebelling and going after Marduk instead. And so these 5 kings are tasked with the mission to subdue this rebellion. But it seems that this wasn't actually the prime reason that they were going. And the prime reason, their target, was something else entirely. Their target was actually Tilmun. Once again, the Sinai Peninsula. This is, as we recall, the spaceport. And so these 5 kings who are mentioned were actually making their way to the spaceport. And oh, Soundwaves Photon, thank you very much for joining. Wonderful to have you here. We're just talking about the spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula and the invasion by the Sumerian armies. And so the Sumerian kings were on their way to take the spaceport by force. And it's at this point, it seems, that Abraham's army is maneuvered to move from the south in Egypt to the Negev, to the barren area which has nothing around except that it is the entrance area. It's the last area that a human is allowed to be on the way to the spaceport, which was obviously off limits. And so as the story goes, Abraham arrived there with his forces and waited for the army of the five kings to approach. And when they did, they went to war, and Abraham was victorious and managed to defeat the invading armies. And so the invading armies after this had decided to move to retreat. The opposing armies who were from Canaan had nothing to do, as it were, with this interaction, and simply seized this as an opportunity and went to attack the kings who had been defeated by Abraham, and hence the whole story unfolds. So in this seemingly very unimportant detail in the biblical version, as it were, we once again get a glimpse that there was a lot of this tension going on. There was a lot of fighting of control over these strategically important facilities, the spaceport and the mission control center in Nippur. And so Abraham, who moved from Ur to Haran and down to Egypt, was once again put into play in order to defend the spaceport from invading armies of both sides. Now, as we recall, Abraham is working under the command of Enlil, and he is only ever loyal to him, as it were. And so when the other kings come to share their spoils with Abraham, he denies taking part in it because, and to his words, he indeed is only working under the sort of the influence of Enlil. Okay, how are we doing for time? 22. Okay, not bad. Let's see. Do we have anything in chat? Absolutely. Nice pictures. Thank you, Blipcoin. Interesting about that top one. I'm not sure I recognize it. Okay, I'll have a look afterwards, because listening to me looking at a picture is probably not the best entertainment. So, at this point, Marduk's forces are again growing in power, and they actually they're not going to war with Abraham at this time. And Abraham himself is not invading into any of these countries, but he's very much on the defensive side of things, as it were. So there's just a few interesting points that I would like to add to this. That sort of ties this into modern times as well. A lot of the cities that are mentioned in the tales and in what Marduk's army go on to do are cities that actually still exist in Israel today with pretty much the same name, and have been for a long, long time. And so Beersheba, which is a strategic city in the south, is one of those that are mentioned. And indeed, there is a mountain or a hill, I'm not sure, one of the highest mountains in Israel, which is called Har Nevo, which is named after the god who gained so much popularity and following in this area, which was, of course, Nabu, the son of Marduk. And so, okay, so this basically brings us to the beginning of the next part. You know what? I've got 20 minutes. I'm afraid we're not going to get very far into the next one. Okay. I'm glad we got here. Let me have a look very quickly, because the next episode, I think, we are actually going to be finishing with Sitchin and with his book. And so I want to time it just right, because last week we ended a little bit in the middle. So let's start a little bit of where the story continues and where it takes us, and we'll see how far we get. In this story, in general, we see once again that the figure of Abraham takes on a whole different meaning when it's seen with these fresh eyes of what's going on in the whole of ancient world at this same time period. Whenever the Bible is talking, it always seems, or at least the interpretation of it, always seems to be rather narrow and very, very Judeo-centric. What's happening that influences the Jews, and how does this basically affect our history? But once we start looking at Abraham and his actions from a much wider perspective, we see the things that he did with a lot more meaning. And so the next really crucial point in our scenario is many, many years later, when Abraham is a much older man. He's 99 years old. And in the biblical tale, which some of you may know, it's told more or less like this. Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent. It's a very hot day. He's out in the desert, and suddenly there are 3 men upon him. And the biblical term is actually malach, which can mean either emissary or divine beings. And obviously it's debated as to which is which. The word emissary in general could very well have meant emissary of the Lord, and that's why the double meaning, as it were. But when Sitchin, once again with these eyes and what we know, approaches this question, we can see a very different meaning, which was, how can it be that someone is looking out into the desert of nothingness, on a hot day, and not notice 3 men who are coming towards him? And if we can consider that maybe, it could have been that Abraham simply didn't care as he saw them coming, his behavior in the following verses clearly shows that he has a very great interest in taking care of these strangers, as it were. He immediately opens a very lavish feast, even ordering his wife to slaughter some of the calves for their meat, for veal, and start cooking and bring water to wash their feet, and the whole 9 yards. So how can it be, if it seems the Bible is portraying it with a sense of urgency, how can it be that Abraham was sitting there not seeing them until it was they were already upon him, and at this point he entered into a flurry and started trying to get everything done, as it were? And the answer again could have been that the men weren't in fact merely men, but were emissaries of the god in some way, and they had either arrived in an unusual fashion, whether it be one of the spaceships, or somehow emerged from somewhere that is not humanly possible, as it were. And so these 3 men come with a very specific message for Abraham. And in fact, we're going to end on this, I think. Abraham at this time is living in a relatively famous city, I think nowadays, and that is the city of Sodom, in Hebrew Sdom. And Sodom and Gomorrah, or Sdom ve'Amorah, are 2 very famous cities because of the events in the Bible. But in fact, the Bible, as it were, mentions them even before the well-known tale in the War of the Kings that we just mentioned. And so one of the opposing kings who was fighting against the invaders for Canaan was indeed the 2 kings were the king of Sodom and the king of Amorah. And so here again, we see this relationship with Abraham might have been established, which had led him to move and live in Sodom for this time when the three emissaries arrived. Okay, I think we're going to stop there. And yes, excellent. Next week, we'll actually continue. So, oh, sorry about that. I'm all over the place this week. Yeah, so next week, I really hope we're going to actually get to the culmination of the Sumerian Empire, this period in human history, according to Sitchin, and a very big shift in the timeline. And following this, for that reason, I'm actually going to do something else. I've said it before, but I'll just remind. I would like the first episode after Sitchin to be a sort of Q&A, to get an idea of what you in the chat are feeling, are thinking about all of these subjects, if there's anything that I've missed or moved over or whatever. If you have any questions, if you have anything that you wanted to ask and you did get a chance to, that will be a great time. If you don't bring any questions, as I'm expecting or should be expected, then we'll go on to one of the other episodes. I'll see what I'll bring. But regardless, I would like to just mention my decision about the next segment part of the podcast, as it were. Now, as some of you will know, mostly those in chat, I think, yeah, you've been with me for a while, we're going to be talking about Drunvalo Melchizedek. Now, Drunvalo Melchizedek might be considered the polar opposite of Sitchin. If all of Sitchin's work is grounded in really science, at least, philological science, but definitely comes from the field of archaeology and the mainstream sciences, as it were, Drunvalo doesn't. To put it very simply, he comes the information that he has been privy to came to him in a very different fashion from pure deduction and research and the work that Sitchin did. So because of this, I'm assuming, and as is sometimes the case, as was the case here, that there are different levels of, knowledge of this and experience and being exposed to these materials. And so, as is always important to me, I'd really like to have like a baseline that we can start on. So, as I know was here, some people in the chat, Patient Zero, etc., were well aware of some of these ideas long before, and some of our listeners are completely new to them. So we're going to try and bridge that gap. And to do this, I'm going to take the first few episodes. I'm not sure how many I will do. We'll see how it goes. But the first few episodes are not actually going to be specifically Drunvalo Melchizedek, because before we can talk about that, we need to establish some terms, literally, define the words that we're using and what they mean. And so we're going to have a few, they could be considered slightly more philosophical, I would say spiritual, but definitely like delving into the theoretical definitions and worldview of reality, the human experience and consciousness, etc. So that's going to be the beginning for a little bit. I hope you enjoy it. It's going to be a pretty big change of pace from what we've been doing over these last few episodes. So we'll see how it goes. This is a very open area, as you all know. I don't guarantee anything at all. I try never to guarantee anything. It's much safer, I feel. But I think it'll be good because we're going to be starting to enter some of these subjects that I've very carefully glossed over when it comes to Sitchin. There's a lot of questions that haven't been answered, and I'm very much aware of this. Sitchin doesn't do any of the work of sort of, as it were, projecting or trying to fill in the gaps when he's not pretty convinced of something. So when it comes to the technologies that the Anunnaki used, or what the priestly duties were really about, Sitchin mentions quite a few times that Terach, Abraham's father, was a priest, and he was specifically the oracle sayer, which means that he was charged with the duty of going to the Holy of Holies, as it was called, the most sacred place, the inner part of the temple that was off limits for everyone, and approach, I think they called it the Whispering Stone, that might be the Greek, but go to the stone and listen for the words of the Lord, and then relay or interpret them for the rest of the people. Sorry. And so it's through this sort of understanding that Sitchin reaches a lot of the conclusions, but he never goes into detail as to what the stone was, how they were communicating, whether it was the physical being of Anunnaki, a speaker of some kind, what the technology literally was. Sitchin doesn't go anywhere near that. And I think rightfully so. In order to do what he did, he had to stay away from anything that isn't scientifically acceptable. Well, not anything, but relatively speaking, almost all of his research is based on these very clear physical evidence. And so that is a specific way of thinking. And in my personal story, that's where I started from. If I, beyond childhood and just not understanding, when I began thinking for myself, rational deduction and physical evidence were the most important things. Definitely much more than some, weirdos, hippie, hokey pokey, whatever nonsense that they're blurting out. Following that, I have quite drastically changed my mind. I'm now definitely one of those crazy hippies who is blurting out nonsense, and I see a lot of merit in that outlook. And so I think, as is very often the case, it's balance that's most important. People have been hurt from being too rational, and people have been hurt from being too irrational. And it seems to be some kind of balance in the middle that's the healthiest way for human beings to be. And because of this, we started off with Sitchin. We started off with for these subjects, the most grounded, scientifically minded research, didactic rationalism, in order to start us off and to give somewhat of a basis for the naysayers. But I warn you now, in this next part, we're going to be leaving a lot of that, I don't want to say rationality, because in my mind it is rational, but definitely the empiricism where you only accept something which can be physically and exactly measured. That viewpoint seems to me to be too narrow to allow for a lot of the truth to get in. And so because of that, we're going to be taking off with Drumvelo, and we're going to be venturing into slightly lesser known worlds. This is, after all, the Discomfort Zone podcast. So I'm very excited to see what the ride is and how it goes. For me personally, I'll be honest, I'm a little more drawn to these subjects nowadays. I think that Sitchin's basis is really important for an understanding, and I certainly wouldn't have reached or wouldn't have understood the things that I know today without that basis. But nevertheless, I personally, maybe we'll go into it further a little bit more. I think I mentioned a few times, I had a very intense experience in India, I should say, the time there, where, I actually witnessed things that were to some extent defying my rationality at that time. And it led me to experience and to investigate some things a little further. And so I think it's definitely time for us to delve into those subjects as well. So just a heads up, that's what's coming up ahead. Let's see. Oh, I see a few people in chat. I'm sorry, I'm still not very good at staying on top of chat always. Oh, wow, lots. Yes, the pictures, and I see all of these pictures. It's just very interesting because if you want, I challenge you, if you care, to look at some of the debunking on these pictures and what they interpret these things to be, because it's very interesting. I'm not saying one way or another that I conclusively know. And for me personally, whether these are UFOs depicted or something else, I believe that there were, well, not unidentified, but flying objects back then. And so the fact that these exist or not, in my mind, is not the crucial evidence. However, listening to someone seeing that and not seeing a UFO and seeing something else is very interesting, instructive, I think. I've read quite a few sort of debunking of Sitchin. There's enough to go around. And although I can't say that upon reading it I was convinced or I thought, oh wow, I didn't think of that. It's interesting to see how the same evidence or the same artifact can be taken in such a different direction by different interpreters to a certain degree. And honestly, as I've mentioned a few times before, I think that is probably closer to the truth than one absolute ideal. To be able to see the truth in both sides at the same time is a very important skill nowadays, I think. But yeah, I definitely see a UFO there, in my mind. The winged sun is conventionally depicted as the knob of the staff of Hermes. What was your theory again? I'm sorry. Yeah, the winged sun is a very interesting depiction, and it obviously appears in many different places, and it could also have different original meanings, as it were. I saw an interesting discussion. There's someone else who we don't actually talk about much. He's also a conspiracy theorist, as it were, and he had a discussion with Sitchin where he claimed something, and Sitchin really shut him down. Basically, saying that that's just completely not true. And it was interesting to see these two sort of, they're both big on language and both agree to a lot of this, the harder stuff to agree with. And nonetheless, there's still this sort of misinterpretation or different interpretations for the same thing. So it's interesting. Before I forget, I'm so sorry. I wrote this down. Oh, shoot, where do I have it? Last week, I mentioned a book, which I don't even know what I called it, but it was about the the life cycle of empires. And I I mentioned Babbage. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know why Babbage came to my mind. Babbage is obviously the computer scientist. The original. The book that I'm talking about is called, I've forgotten it again. Hang on, let me just have a look very quickly. The Empire Life Cycle. The Empire Life Cycle. Yes, and the author's name is Glubb, John Glubb. I can't remember his name. He has a middle name. And so John Glubb wrote, it wasn't actually even a book, it was more a sort of essay. You can download it for free. I just wanted to correct my the name that I gave last week. My apologies. I will try to be more on top of it next time. But if you are interested, it's a fascinating read. And if you want to, I would suggest reading it specifically thinking of the empires that are crumbling around us today. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining. I think I'm out of time for now, but I will be here next week. I hope to see you all there. Have a wonderful week and enjoy yourselves, basically. Yeah. Have a good one.